So the last question that we really need to approach here when we're talking about communism as an economic system and a political theory is to ask, has this recipe, the 10-point plan, the transition between socialism to communism, has it been applied anywhere in real life? And can we point to any examples of nations who've implemented a communistic, Marxian economic system? And what can we learn if we've had some of these examples? Now, I have to say from the onset that I recognize fully that the individuals and the nations that I'm going to talk about here are gross examples of communism, but I think they're important for two reasons. First, each of these different regimes had implemented Marx's 10-point plan almost to a T. If you run through and use that 10-point plan as a checklist per se, we can see that Mao, Pol Pot, and Stalin had all done these collectivized communes that Marx had called for in the Communist Manifesto. I won't read these to you per se. You can take a look as we go. But the numbers really speak for themselves when we have tried to collectivize and remove private property from individuals by using the state. Remember, Marx himself says that for this transition period, for this political transformation, he calls it, it requires that the state be dictator. And here we have three of the more infamous examples of dictatorial regimes trying to implement this plan. So why does this happen? I mean, those numbers seem staggering. In the tens of millions of people, in fact, communism has been responsible as an ideology for the death of more individuals than fascism or imperialism or anything to that extent. And so we really want to know why does this happen in real life? Why don't we see the utopia that Marx had predicted would happen as a result of implementing the 10-point plan? And I think we can go back to this graphic to really get an idea. If you remember, part of this idea was for an individual, a strong-hand individual, to come in and almost act as a monarch to implement the plan. But notice that before we said that the government was simply a catapult to take us across the bridge to the other. And this required that the individual in charge actually relinquish their power. And we've seen in all of these examples of strong dictatorial communist leaders, they are altogether unwilling to relinquish their power, right? To essentially remove the state and return the power. So individuals are stuck in this transition period between socialism and communism. And that's why I think it's more safe to say that most of the states today that are deemed socialist, or communist rather, are actually socialist in nature. And I think it might be worth saying also, just as an observation, that it may well be not only impractical but impossible for us to make this hurdle, to ask self-interested people, especially power-seeking people like dictators and other leaders, to ever give up the power once it's been given to them. Yet that's exactly what Marx's plan requires here. So last question before we wrap up communism as a theory and an economic system, and that is, can we at least point to some examples of communism alleviating or getting rid of the class system that Marx tried to get out? Can we at least point to this success? And the answer, we'll see the answer to this question is a resounding, loud and clear no. In fact, when we look to the world and we look to any remaining communist or socialist nations, what we see is a greater deal of inequality across the board in these nations. Now, why is that? Why would the very system that seeks as a goal to eliminate classes and inequality actually creates that? Well, remember Marx said that capitalism created inequality by dividing society up through private property into the haves and the have-nots. He called the haves the bourgeoisie and the have-nots the proletariat. He said that the bourgeoisie were the few. There were not many who had capital and owned factories and owned the means of production. And he said the many, the masses, were those who were left at the bottom, laboring for a subsistence wage and being exploited, their labor being exploited by the capitalists. They were essentially slaves to the bourgeoisie, according to Marx. So he sets out this system, communism, to get rid of that. But in real life, when we look at the application, we see the very same inequality, the same division between haves and have-nots. It's just different people who occupy these two realms now. Now, instead of the bourgeoisie be the haves, it's the government. Government officials are the ones who are the haves. If the state owns the property, the state is abstract. It's individuals who can only own property, and it's the individuals who've occupied power within the government that own this property. They're the ones who owns the means of production and the factors of production, and they get to make the decisions. Even more so, and they wield even more power than the bourgeoisie did when Marx was writing. So who's left at the bottom? Well, instead of the proletariat, as Marx calls them, the factory workers being at the bottom, it's you and me. It's the individual citizens. It is the masses who are left at the bottom. And Marx would claim that the proletariat, the workers, were slaves to the bourgeoisie. But when we think about it, by definition of slavery, it may well be the case that individuals are actually slaves, not just figuratively, as Marx said, but they're actually slaves to the state in a communist society because their labor belongs to the state, and therefore so do they.